Awesome. I think I might be slightly late tonight, 53 seconds late. But I'm here and I'm glad to be here. I've had a ball of a time in the last 6 sessions, and tonight is session 7, and 7 is going to be fun. I think 7 is going to be, if I do the job properly, 7 is going to be the best session. And if I do my job properly tonight, I believe that session 7, Origin Stories, is going to be maybe light bulb moment for some people. I hope so. But once again, my job here is not for me to try and convince you to believe any particular thing about the devil, but rather just to show that there, in fact, is this notion of the evolution of the idea in the very early history. So, quick recap of session 6 that we did last week. I'm going to read the recap so I don't go on and on. It's highly probable, at least to me, that the Persian ideas influenced Jewish thought during the 200 years as a province of Persia, especially with respect to a more dualistic worldview in which God and his heavenly representatives, angels, are in a cosmic battle against evil spirits and their leader. Now, even if we, me, you, anybody, deny the Persian influence and say they weren't influenced by the Persians, it is still hard to ignore the actual evolution of the idea in early Hebrew thought that we pick up on in the scriptures. All right, that said, tonight we're going to the Hellenistic period. Now, for those of you who don't know, I think Helle, or whatever, is the Greek word for Greek. But the point is that the Hellenistic period is the period under the Greeks, under Greek culture. Now, this starts in around 333 BCE. These dates are important, right? And it runs to about 63 BCE, in which the Romans do their thing. Okay, let's get going. So Persian rule was rather peaceful for the Jews, as we showed last week. There was no hostile takeover by the Persians. Instead, they allowed the Jews to go back, rebuild their land and religion as a province of Persia. Now, approximately 200 years later, after this, in 336 BCE, there arose a ruler that would accomplish the extraordinary feat of conquering the entire Persian Empire in a decade, right? Remember, this is the biggest empire the world's ever seen. His name, Alexander III of Macedon, also known as Alexander the Great, right? He was a Greek. So, tutored personally by Aristotle, this Greek-speaking 30-year-old created one of the largest empires in the history, from Greece to India, and he would go down in history as one of the most successful military commanders. Now, his death, which he did eventually die, and he died very young, quite soon after he conquered the entire thing, was the start of what is called the Hellenistic period. And this is the period in which all the territories, the ancient territories that were under Greek rule, started to be influenced by Greek culture. And this Hellenistic period, in which the Greek culture and its influence and power reached its peak in the Mediterranean and beyond, right? So more or less around the Mediterranean, Prosperity and progress in art, literature, theater, architecture, music, mathematics, philosophy, and science characterized this era. It was a great era for great progress. If you're a fan of Greek philosophy, you'll know what's going on. After the death of Alexander the Great, though, the empire was divided up into 4 regions. And now 2 of these regions are relevant to us. The Seleucid dynasty that comes from the north up over into Iran, and then the Ptolemaic kingdom from the south out from Egypt. 2 of these regions, these 2 specifically, would have a profound effect on Jewish life in Jerusalem. So, let me quote. Under the suzerainty of the Ptolemaic kingdom and later the Seleucid Empire, Judea witnessed a period of peace and protection of its institutions. So far, so good. For their aid against his Ptolemaic enemies, Antiochus III the Great promised the Jews a reduction in taxes. Awesome. And helped to fund them to repair their city, Jerusalem, and also with some of the Second Temple stuff, right? Because by this time it had taken a couple of clubs. Now, relations unfortunately deteriorated under Antiochus' successor, Seleucus IV, Philopator, and then, for reasons not fully understood, his successor, here's the main dude, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He drastically overturned the previous policy of respect and protection, banning key Jewish religious rites and traditions in Judea, and sparking a traditionalist revolt against Greek rule. Now, out of this revolt was formed an independent Jewish kingdom known as the Hasmonean dynasty, which lasted from 165 to 63. That's a little bit of history. Let's talk about Greek influence, particularly in terms of Greek language on the Jewish people. For example, the Hellenization of the known world conquered by Alexander the Great of Macedonia profoundly impacted the nations then under his control, to the extent, and this is well known, and it's an amazing thing that happened. All the schools and universities, called gymnasiums back then, of that era were conducted in Greek language. So you could still be in Judea and speak your Aramaic, but your schools and your places where people go to learn science, philosophy, etc., would be in Greek. The average man in the street might speak the language that he inherited by his parents, but the language of learning and progress, and of course the elite, was Greek. Now, this new language brings novel patterns of thought and ideas, because with it come history of a certain way of thought that the language developed to accommodate very well. So, this Hellenization eventually resulted in the Jewish world to the translation of the Old Testament into Greek. It's called the Septuagint, right? This is actually the version that Paul and the apostles were accustomed to and actually read from. By extension, this Hellenization and the Greek philosophical thought that accompanied it also further influenced the thought and the theology of the early church fathers, not excluding the apostles. Don't want to talk about that tonight, we're not going there, but if you don't know that New Testament thought was influenced by Greek philosophy, time to read a bit more. Now, consider the fact that the New Testament was mostly written in Greek by Jews under Roman rule, and historically thoroughly Greek philosophical concepts like the idea of logos we find in the book of John, that we just assumed to be a great Jewish idea, was thoroughly Greek. And this idea can be extended further by realizing that as a result of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, ideas that were not in the original Hebrew translation makes their way into Greek philosophy, into theology. Ideas, I don't want to mention examples here, but one of them is the virgin birth, and there's a couple of others as well. Okay, so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it needs to be acknowledged that it's a very real and a concrete influence on the culture that was had, and for our study also on the theology. Language is ultimately a vehicle for cultural and religious syncretism. Now, let's talk about the Hellenistic. That's all the history we're going to do tonight. Let's talk about the Hellenistic period for the Jews, and this is where it gets really, really interesting, right? Obviously, their hopes for complete independence is dashed, and they end up under the Hellenistic powers. Now, let me say this, that before the influence of the Persian religious concepts, Jewish ideas of angels as messengers of God was quite different, right? In the early traditions, angels were nameless. They were basically anonymous. They did not have a name. They were messengers, but anonymous messengers. They would represent God to deliver a message or enacting a mission from God. But they would never have a name. I mean, you'd hear the angel of death. That's not a name. But what happens in this Hellenistic period is we see things change. We start seeing angels with names. After the exile and after this time of or under the Persian influence and now into the Hellenistic period, we find Jewish angels have names, they have personalities. Very much like the Zoroastrian Yazatas we spoke about the 7 of them we spoke about last week. Some evidence we find in the book of Daniel. And so the book of Daniel is our last landing place in the Hebrew scriptures. Right, but I want to start by saying and mentioning that there are 3 works of literature that was highly probably influenced by Persian ideas and would emerge in the Hellenistic period. These are the 3. You might know some of them, you might not. Enoch, Book of Enoch, Book of Jubilees. Now, these 2 books might be unfamiliar to you because it's not part of the Hebrew canon. But it is part of Hebrew canon in Ethiopia and also Christian canon in Ethiopia. Me and you, it's not canon to us, so you probably have never read it. Here's the deal. But we don't always realize that we've actually been influenced by it, because during this period, the Hellenistic period, in Jewish thought, Enoch, the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, both these books were highly influential books. They influenced the way people thought about God, about evil spirits and angels, etc., etc. And we're going to be talking about that today. And they also are kind of like the interface in which we see emerging some of these older Persian ideas. Then the 3rd book, number 1 is Enoch, number 1 is Jubilees. The 3rd one is the one you know very well. It's the book of Daniel. It's the one we love. Oh my word, if I preach out of the book of Daniel. It's the one included in the canon. Now, all 3 of these books have new ideas about angels that we don't find previously in the scriptures, right? So this should tell us something. Like, once again, if you don't believe the Zoroastrians or the Persians caused this influence, okay, ignore that, throw that, chuck it out. But you have to acknowledge the change in thought. It's there, right? And that's hard to deny. In these books, angels become princes that fight God. The evil angels, the evil spirits become, and they're actually called princes, that fight God, and not only God, but also God's angels. In these books we see, for instance, the first time the idea of an archangel appearing. In the book of Enoch, there's 7 archangels. I don't know them all off by heart, but it's just strange that there's 7, considering what we learned last week. But point is, it's in these books, Enoch, Daniel, Jubilees, where we meet archangels. In other words, these are fighting angels. These are the main dudes. And they go and fight these princes. This is just not something we see in earlier Old Testament scripture, but in these books, they appear. Right, so I like to call them gang fights. This is where the gang fights start, the spiritual gang fights. And some of the stories where all of this started. I mentioned quickly, I don't know if you're familiar with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls last century. And it was a great discovery. It's the oldest manuscripts of the books of the Bible, right? Which is a great discovery for Christianity, for the Jews to see that there are much older manuscripts. Before that, we basically had something from 1,000 years ago. Now we have something from 1,000 or 2,000, 200 years ago. That's amazing. It's the discovery of the century. But what a lot of people don't know is, with all the books of the Old Testament, I just want to, okay, perfect. I had a quick interruption there. So this is how we know that these books were still highly influential during the Hellenistic period, and actually beyond, but we're talking about the Hellenistic period, that they're found with the biblical canon, or what we consider the biblical canon, in the Qumran caves, in the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let's talk about the book of Daniel. Now, I don't want to go into detail the book of Daniel. You probably read it. Some of it is a bit of a mystery for some. I've many times thought I had it figured out, and now I'm not so sure anymore. But the book of Daniel represents for us, within the Hebrew canon, a further evolution of the idea of Satan and his evil forces, how they work in the cosmos and in the Hebrew scriptures. While the same ideas we find in Enoch and Jubilees, which sits outside our canon. Some would even say that Enoch and Jubilees, or at least Enoch, influenced Daniel to a large degree, or the writing of Daniel. Right. Now, here's something controversial, and this is it. Scholars estimate that the origin of the book of Daniel the writing of the book of Daniel happened during the Hellenistic period, although it is set in 6th century Babylonian exile. In other words, it's telling the story of the exile, but it was actually written a lot later. Two main reasons for that is Daniel gets the Babylonian kings wrong, and Daniel's language is Aramaic, there's portions of Aramaic, and the portions of Aramaic that is found in the book of Daniel dates to a much later Aramaic than the one that could have existed in the 6th century. All of this said, this is why Daniel, Enoch, and Jubilees more or less sits together in this Hellenistic period. Okay, not too much I want to say about that. But most agree that it came to be in the period of the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, when he comes to profane the temple, and this is kind of what these things are that are in the book of Daniel speak of. And this is not the traditional view, it's not the view I grew up with, but it's the one that I've adopted. We leave it at that. The point is simply that in the book of Daniel, we suddenly have angels who have names, right? For the first time in the Hebrew Bible. For example, Gabriel, Michael, etc. Before this, title was always Angel of the Lord. I've said all of these things. This was usually curious to me when I found this out for the first time, and I wanted to know why. Why only here so late in the history of the Jewish thought does this happen? Why is there no Gabriel and Michael when Moses did stuff, and Abraham, and David, and all the others, right? In addition to the angelic forces in Daniel, these forces are also now starting to be associated with specific areas or nations, right? This also seems to be new to the Hebrew idea of angels. So, for instance, in the book of Daniel, you have the prince of the kingdom of Persia. So this supposedly seems to be an evil force that is over Persia, it's over that nation and spiritual force. And now Michael is fighting against that spiritual force. So actually in the book of Daniel, we find the first indicators of what people today will call spiritual warfare, where there's gang fight. It's God and his representative angels, archangels, and whatever else, whatnot you've got. And then you have this Satan, leader of the evil spirits, and his gang. And these guys are fighting in the air above us. And so it's obvious that when Daniel thinks of Persia, when Daniel thinks of his own country, he thinks of fighting forces. And in the book of Daniel also, of course, is about the Hellenizers, and it's specifically, scholars believe, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which comes to desecrate the temple. And so what happens on earth, the fighting of nations, to Daniel is actually much more. It's actually these spiritual forces and princes, archangels fighting. It's a gang fight at the very top. So, the prince of the king of Persia, for instance, withstands the messenger angel to Daniel until Michael, one of the chief archangels, come to help him. And some spiritual beings are doing the work of resistance and becoming an adversary, Satan actually, to the messengers of God. All right. But the question is, where does this type of thinking come from? Because it's not in the early scriptures. So the earliest surviving memory of Michael comes from the 3rd century BCE Jewish apocalyptic book called Enoch. Right, here we're popping into Enoch now for the first time. In other words, Daniel also was influenced by other writers. Now, Enoch, we as Christians, we don't recognize it as scripture. But you'll be surprised how much of what is in Enoch forms your view of the world. You can watch the video I popped on earlier today, give you a quick overview of the book of Enoch. And you'll find in there that there's a lot of stuff in Enoch that we believe, but we can't find it in the other, in the older Hebrew scriptures, right? And it is true, and it seems to me quite plausible, that the New Testament absorbs the ideas of Enoch into its theology and into its worldview. It's just accepted. It's the ocean we swim in. Right, so Enoch. Now, you might not know, but Enoch is actually referred to a couple of times in the New Testament, sometimes explicitly, sometimes the concepts in it. And it has Michael as the primary amongst the 7 archangels. Their names are Uriel, Raphael, it sounds like the Ninja Turtles to me, Sariel, Gabriel, Ramiel, and then Michael. The names may vary depending on the source, but Gabriel, Michael, and Raphael, they're always there, right? Mentioned in many branches of the Christian faith. So if you never knew where the Archangel Michael comes from, it comes from the book that you don't believe is in the Bible. That's a little bit scary, or that we believe shouldn't be in the Bible. Okay, so many scholars believe that it is the Persian ideas that actually contain the earliest ideas of these large angels and princes and the gang fights, right? Called in Zoroastrianism called the Amishpentas, beings of immortal holiness likened unto the archangels. So they individually inhabit immortal bodies that operate in the physical world. They come to protect, to guide, to inspire humanity. They were involved in the creation of things, and then also in the spirit world. So the Amishpentas were also the first word was not Amish. There was an autocorrection by my pages document. It's the Amishpentas. They were also inspirational in creation. I've said that. So, and they were also charged to protect holy lands, areas in their emanation in service to God. So, some will suggest that these appearances in the book of Daniel is in fact a direct result of the mixing of Jewish and Persian thought, right? Because it wasn't there earlier. That's the reason. That's the only reason. And because the Jews were under the Persians for so long. So ideas that developed during their time, these are ideas that developed under their time in the Babylonian exile and under their time in the Persian Empire. Whether that's true or not, the point is simply that these ideas are late and not found in earlier Yahwistic belief. So these evil princes or angels, then Michael and Gabriel has to fight. Within a representative, I made some mistakes here, and I changed it earlier today, and for some reason I was on iCloud and it didn't make all the changes when I went through all of it, so some of it's a little bit jumbled up. So basically these evil princes, they fight Gabriel, they fight Michael, and their leader is Satan, is the main dude of the gang fight, and their job is to resist God. To resist the purpose of God, to resist the angels of God, and so on. You know the story because this is how we were brought up. But it's also at this junction that backstories arose as to how these evil angelic forces and their leader came about. So think with me now. Although Satan and demons or his evil fallen angels are not mentioned explicitly in First Temple Yahwism and early Second Temple Judaism, now here when we get to the Hellenistic period, it is assumed that they exist. Right? Thought has changed. The consciousness about these things have changed. It's not just God and his angels, it's God, his angels, and it's Satan and his demons. But the point is, for a Jew that now reads the early Yahwistic scriptures, there's nothing about this stuff in there. So what do we do? They need an explanation. They need a way to explain the origin. Like, okay, if the scriptures don't speak about it explicitly, but we believe it's here, where does it come from? We need an origin for the devil and his angels. Where does the devil come from? All right. So tonight we're going to be focusing on origin stories, and we're going to be doing 2 of 3. The first 2 are older, and the last one is going to be the fun one. We're going to do that next week, but okay, let me get into this. To understand where the devil come from, they did what we still do today. They went back into if you get this is important, they go back into the Hebrew scriptures to find something that to them, because of what they now know, reflects and resembles something like the devil. And then they reinterpret those ancient scriptures or passages to be in service of their now own later contemporary belief. Now, might have to rewind that and listen to that again, but that is basically the explanation of retrojective interpretation. This is going to look for muffins in the wheat. But this is what we as humans do, and the Jews did exactly the same thing. They went back into their scriptures and said, you see here, you see here. And we're going to be dealing with them right now. I'm going to show you these ones, how in a very quick fashion. It's not going to be complicated, but it is very obvious that they started taking portions that had nothing to do with the devil and made it about the devil because they needed an explanation for the devil. And to be truthful, we still do the same thing today. So let me give you 3 examples of this. The first one I've already given you last week. It's rewriting of of the portion in Samuel where God tells David to number the people. In 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1 to 2, written about 200 years later, just before the Hellenistic period, they now rewrite it. And they say, no, it wasn't God who told David to number the people, it was Satan. And this is the only, portion in the entire Hebrew scriptures where Satan is mentioned as, it seems like, the name of a being. And it is also very, very late. So what do? They go take Samuel, which was written 400 years before, and they completely, maybe not that long, maybe about 200 or 250 years before, and they actually rewrote it and put Satan inside. I mean, this is even worse than retrojective interpretation. They rewrote the scriptures to include their current ideas. There's another one I mentioned last week, and I did a little bit more investigation on this one. And it's found in the book of Jubilees. And the book of Jubilees is known for going back and rewriting Genesis and a small portion of Exodus. And what this book does is it basically takes out all the embarrassing things that could be attributed to God or any of the patriarchs. And one of these is where God asked Abraham to kill his son. Now, the book of Jubilees writes, and he says, no, that's not what happened. The prince, and the name prince, the word prince, and they used Prince Mastema, right, who is called in the book of Jubilees the prince of demons. He came to God, and he said to God, look at Abraham. I bet you he will not love you. He will not follow you if you tell him to kill his son. So tell him to kill his son, and let's see what happens. And then God told Abraham to sacrifice his son. So they go back, they take portions of scripture, and they write Mastema, they write the prince of demons back into the portions. So that's another example of that. But one of the better portions of retrojective interpretation is what we find in the book of Enoch, and we're going to be spending a bit of time there today. I'm just going to mention it briefly. The book of Enoch goes back to Genesis 6. If you remember Genesis 6, the sons of God come down, they have sex with the women of men, and these giant things are born, right? The book of Enoch goes back, rewrites that portion, and says this is where Satan, Azazel, called Azazel in the Enoch account, and his demons come from. And so these are 3 examples of how the Jews from that time, right, took their new idea that there has to be a devil and demons and started retrojectively interpret the old scriptures to put him there. Right. Okay. So in other words, what we typically see in these stories as a reinterpretation of the passages. These passages can actually stand alone in the ancient historical context without the need to read Satan into them. The need to read Satan or to read a Satan into them developed much later. They are reinterpreted to mean something they did not mean before the belief in a being called Satan was established. But now that we have interpreted some of these older passages in the light of the idea of Satan for more than 2,000 years. Now, here's the thing, and this is not applicable to the ones I've mentioned, but it's going to become applicable to some other passages. Once you have looked at a portion of the Old Testament and said, this is definitely Satan, although it doesn't say so, and you've been doing it for 1,000 years, 500 years, maybe your tradition has been doing it for 500 years, and you've been alive for 50 years, and you've been doing it for 50 years. We actually become incapable of seeing those passages for what they actually meant to the people who wrote them and the people they were written to, because we force our view back onto them. We're looking for muffins, right? And we become completely unable to see them in any other light than the light of the interpretations that we have come to. We will have a look at some of these origin stories and the associated scriptural passages as we find them along our way. So, okay, I've got 15 minutes left. We're going to do origin story number 1. This one is called Azazel in Enoch. Now, this is one, let me just say this. I've heard this preached from pulpits. Although not one of the things I'm going to be telling you today is actually in the canon of Hebrew scripture. People preach this stuff. And that tells me that we have adopted stuff from Enoch. We don't believe in Enoch. None of us reads Enoch in the morning for scriptural reading. We don't do that. But we've accepted the ideas in there without knowing, because it comes to us through our tradition. Let's have a look. Now, the sons of God in Genesis 6, in the book of Enoch, Enoch, it's not really Enoch who wrote this book, of course. Enoch was like, he lived before Noah, right? In the scriptures. So somebody else is writing the book of Enoch, attributing it to Enoch, because Enoch never died, he went up to be with God, right? And now he reinterprets all these old passages. Now he goes to Genesis 6, right? So here's how it goes. The sons of God had intercourse with the human woman. They gave birth to giants in the earth called the Nephilim, right? And when these giants drowned in the flood, their disembodied souls, their spirits, became demons. Boom, there you go, people. Problem solved. We know where demons come from. At least the writers of Enoch thought that they had solved the problem. There we go. We wrote it back in. Now we have an origin story for where the demons come from. And of course, the leader of these demons were, at first it was someone else, but later it became Azazel, right? Which is later translated or understood to be the devil, who was once a primary angel in heaven. Now, this story that I've just briefly mentioned to you is kind of a patchwork between Genesis 6, 1 to 6, the portion I've just mentioned, then 1 Enoch 6 verse 9, something you probably never read in your entire life, and then a small little dollop of Leviticus 16. Let's have a quick look. 1 Enoch 6 to 8 says basically something along the following lines, right? It's a bit of a summary, but listen to this. It is the book of Enoch that gives an explanation for who these sons of God were. According to Enoch, they were heavenly beings that were led by Shemi-Hazah. Shemi-Hazah. Heavenly beings led by Shemi-Hazah. Nowhere in your Bible, it's in Enoch. Heavenly beings led by some guy, right? Later, Azazel becomes the leader eventually. But anyway, 200, exactly 200 of these beings made an oath. They descended on Mount Hermon to have children with human women. The names of these angels are listed. You can go read it if you like. Most of them have a name that references God. Remashel, El, which means evening of God. Kokabel, which means the star of God. Daniel, the judge of God. Anyway, there is a theory. Some scholars say this is where Daniel comes from, but it's a long story. These beings teach humans magical medicines, right? Incantations, the cutting of roots and plants. Their children are giants and they stand 300 cubits tall. Hello, that's 150 meters. The giants start eating animals and humans because the humans can't feed them enough food. They also drink the blood of animals, and so they sin against them, right? It's against the Noahic command. But it is the angel Azazel that teaches the humans, you're not going to believe this, ladies, you're not going to believe this. He teaches the humans metalworking and how to make eyeshadow. Eyeshadow. Always knew it was evil. There you go. So the angels end up teaching humans all sorts of sinful practices. Humanity then cries out to God and say to God, we are oppressed by these angelic divine beings that have created these giants, and we can't deal with this any longer, right? This, according to Enoch, is the reason there was a flood. Not because of the humans, because of the rebellion of the angelic beings. Ever heard this term before? The rebellion of the angelic beings. Right now, I know last time you read Genesis, like me, you never read about the rebellion of any beings. That's not how Genesis goes. That's not how the Jews believed the world came about. There was no rebellion in the book of Genesis. This account in Enoch is significantly different from the one we have in Genesis, right? But it provides a neat explanation for the origin of the devil and his demons. So, basically, sons of God, there was a rebellion, these divine beings came, and they eventually formed the fallen angels with their leader, right? Now we know, there's another way to read Genesis, to understand that sons of God in Genesis is simply a reference to polytheistic ideas of early Yahwism. But Enoch, or the writer of Enoch during the Hellenistic period, because he now sits with the gang fight, has to explain the gang fight, and he uses the old scriptures to explain the gang fight. Right. And so Enoch also goes to Leviticus. In Leviticus 16, 6 to 10, there's the idea of the Day of Atonement. And there's these two goats. And one goat is for God, and the other must be sent into the desert for Azazel. What is this? Well, it probably was, it's not mentioned in the Bible again, understood as the personification of wickedness, much like Satan was during that time. But Enoch takes that word and makes that the leader of all these angelic beings. And he puts these concepts together, and now you have a story and an origin story for the devil and his evil angels. So this is origin story number one. This is not one that me and you are very familiar with, although you would have heard something like this, hopefully not from your pulpits, but from some other source you might have heard something like this. And this seems how the Jews of the Hellenistic era thought about where the devil, the lead evil spirit, angel, and all these demons come from. It was a rebellion of these angels or of spirits or whatever, or beings in the heavens. They came down, they produced something on earth. And you can go read a bit more about that, Enoch. I don't want to say too much about it, but there you go. That's origin story number one. Beautiful example of retrojective interpretation. The writer of Enoch saying, well, we have this muffin, let's see if we can find it earlier on, and then goes and finds wheat, finds sugar cane, finds rivers, and say, look, here the muffins are in the water, here the muffins are here the muffins are. Illegal ways of interpreting, but this is what we humans do. This is how we make sense of our world. We take and read into scriptures and passages that which we already believe. Because if you didn't already believe it, you won't find angelic rebellious beings in the book of Genesis, right? So the second story is one you are probably more familiar with. This one I've heard from pulpits often, and it might hit a little bit closer to home. And I got 6 minutes to deal with this guy. There's not much to say here, but the point is, it comes from a book. This book is called, this is not Genesis, it's another book, a book that's written that's not considered as canonical, but during more or less the same time. It's called the Book of Adam and Eve. Boom, there you go. The Book of Adam and Eve, or it's also called Contradiction of Adam and Eve, or the Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan. There, the name gives everything away. Now you would think, sure, that's very weird, because we know what happened in the garden according to Genesis. There was really no real conflict. There was disobedience. Anyway, this book in chapter 13 to 15 goes like this. It's a history of what actually took place in the days of Adam and Eve, after they were cast out from the Garden of the Garden of Eden. It is believed to be the work of an unknown Egyptian writer who wrote, Egyptian writer who wrote the story in Arabic, and eventually the book was translated into Ethiopic. It was probably written a few hundred years BC, so that puts us right with Jubilees, Enoch and Daniel, which falls during this very late Second Temple period. So the story is strongly linked to the creation of Adam. Here's how it goes. Now, you might recognize some of this. If you grew up in Pentecostal church, you're going to recognize some of this. And you're going to know where this comes from for the first time in your life. When God asked the angels to pay homage or to honor Adam as the image of God, one angel said, no ways. He rebelled and he refused to do so. And he did this because he felt that Adam should actually pay homage to him and honor him, since he was pre-existent and Adam is new kid on the block. Right? Other angels agreed with this leading angel and joined his rebellion, and they were expelled from heaven. How many times have you heard this in church? How many times did you in church hear this? That the angels, I think my dad used to say this at some point, that Satan was jealous of Adam and Eve as image of God, and that's the reason why they rebelled, and that's why they were chucked out. Now, me and you know very well, there's nothing like that in the Hebrew canon. This is where it comes from. How? Now, my question is, how does that make it onto a pulpit in 2023, onto a Christian pulpit, if you can't really find it in the scriptures? That tells me that these ideas, you might say, the book of Adam and Eve, those ideas are the book of Enoch. They are carried in the cultural memory into the New Testament, through the New Testament into the church, into the Catholic era, into the Protestant era. It eventually makes its way to us. Maybe it skips a couple of generations, but how in the world does it get onto a 21st century pulpit? But now, you know, if you didn't, kind of where that idea comes from. It is probably also this origin story that we assume, and it's because of this origin story that we sometimes assume that the snake in the Garden of Eden had to be the devil, because he was now there. He was upset. He was cast out. Now he's a snake on the earth. Now he's on the earth. Now he's coming and he wants to ruin Adam and Eve. He wants to ruin God's plan. And this is his motivation for creating havoc and evil in the world, because he was hard done by God, and he hates humanity because he's jealous of them. Guys, I'm sorry, this is not in the scriptures. This is ideas from the Hellenistic period that has somehow made its way into our own Christian cultural memory. So there you go. Now, origin story number 3. This is the one that's going to be the most fun and the hardest to explain. Is the one, and we call this origin story Lucifer. Now, this is one which, if you, like me, grew up in the 80s and 90s, which I now understand to be the era of satanic panic, you know that when you were a kid, you didn't even say this name. I remember me and my sisters scaring each other at night when my parents were in there by saying the name Lucifer until the other person would get scared, right? The name carries so much weight because we physically believed that it was the actual name of the devil, right? But I want to suggest, at least to you, that considering Lucifer the name of Satan is again a case and point example of retrojective interpretation. And we get our ideas, and this Lucifer origin story comes from mainly 2 passages in early Isaiah 14, and also in Ezekiel 28, which is prophecy against 2 kings. And we have gone to those portions and said, no, it can't be. This is about the devil. So we're going to be talking about that next week. Now, unfortunately, I was going to end off so well, and now I don't have the notes I made, and I need to just quickly have a look here as I finish off tonight. Well, this is obviously going to be the most familiar origin story we all know, as Protestant Christians at least. Like you'll see later on, the Catholics are responsible for giving us this story, but boy, oh boy, did we took it hook, line, and sinker. Origin story 1 and 2 is easy for us to dismiss, even though some of you might have preached it or heard it from the pulpit and took it as gospel truth. But origin story number 3, Lucifer, is one that hits much closer to home. it is so embedded in us that it can actually make a kid scared that grew up in satanic panic. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. We're going to be looking at this last origin story, and next week is session 8. And I had such a nice name for session 8, and now it's not in my notes, but I think I called session 8, Can I Have a Lucifer Muffin? So with that, I leave you tonight. Thank you so much for being with me. Next week, we're going to have a look at the origin story named Lucifer from Ezekiel and Isaiah. I hope tonight helped someone. If you have questions, let me know. Have a good night, guys. I'll see you next week.